Timbuktu, an ancient city nestled on the edge of the Sahara Desert, was once the heart of intellectual, cultural, and economic activity in medieval Africa. Its legend has endured for centuries, drawing awe and fascination not just for its wealth, but also for the profound role it played in shaping the course of history. Long before the word Timbuktu became synonymous with a far-flung, almost mythical place, it was a thriving metropolis at the crossroads of trade, knowledge, and civilization. The city's allure was built upon its unique geographical position, sitting at the meeting point of trans-Saharan trade routes, where merchants and scholars alike converged from all corners of the continent and beyond. It was a place where gold, salt, and manuscripts were exchanged in equal measure, and where the intellectual legacy of Africa was preserved, celebrated, and transmitted to the world. The origins of Timbuktu are as enigmatic as its rise to prominence. Historians are still piecing together the timeline of its emergence, but it is generally believed that the city began as a modest settlement around the 11th century, founded by Tuareg nomads who sought refuge in the region's fertile land. Over time, its position on the edge of the desert allowed it to grow into a key trading hub for salt, gold, ivory, and other precious commodities, drawing merchants from across the Muslim world, Europe, and Asia. As the wealth of the city grew, so too did its influence, becoming a center of Islam in West Africa. The introduction of Islam in the 11th century, through both the spread of trade and the influence of neighboring empires like the Almoravid dynasty, laid the foundation for Timbuktu's transformation into a cultural and intellectual epicenter. What set Timbuktu apart from other trading cities of the time was not just its material wealth, but its spiritual and intellectual prosperity. The city became synonymous with knowledge, attracting scholars, poets, theologians, and scientists from distant lands. This intellectual flourishing was further bolstered by the founding of the University of Sankore, a renowned center of learning that rivaled the great universities of medieval Europe and the Middle East. It was here in the bustling courtyards and shaded corridors of the Sankore Mosque that some of the most brilliant minds of the Islamic world gathered to engage in debates, write treatises, and preserve centuries of knowledge. Timbuktu was also home to some of the most impressive libraries of the time, many of which housed vast collections of manuscripts, ancient texts that covered a wide range of subjects, from astronomy to medicine, mathematics, theology, and history. The city's libraries were repositories of wisdom, and the manuscripts they held were priceless artifacts, often transcribed by hand and bound with exquisite care. These texts were not just valuable for their content, but for the way they encapsulated the intellectual heritage of Africa, a heritage that was often overlooked or overshadowed by the dominance of European and Islamic traditions. In Timbuktu, however, this knowledge was preserved, revered, and passed down through generations of scholars, who continued to build upon the intellectual achievements of their predecessors. Yet, despite its reputation as a city of gold and knowledge, Timbuktu's legacy is not without its complications. The city's wealth, as impressive as it was, also made it a target for raiders, conquerors, and colonial powers who sought to plunder its riches and undermine its intellectual authority. During the 16th century, the Songhai Empire, which had long been one of West Africa's most powerful empires, began to decline, and with it, Timbuktu's political and economic influence waned. The city's libraries were looted, and many of its manuscripts were lost or destroyed in the turmoil of conflict and colonization. The legacy of Timbuktu, though, was never fully erased. Even as the city's material wealth diminished, its intellectual and cultural legacy endured, preserved in the memories of those who had once called it home and in the handful of manuscripts that survived the ravages of time. Today, the city of Timbuktu is no longer the bustling center of trade and scholarship that it once was. Its status as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and the ongoing efforts to protect its ancient manuscripts highlight the city's enduring significance as a symbol of Africa's rich history. The legacy of Timbuktu is not just about the gold it once produced or the intellectual achievements it nurtured. It is about the broader contribution of Africa to world civilization, a contribution that has often been marginalized or forgotten in the narratives of history. By revisiting the story of Timbuktu, we are not just uncovering the past of a single city, but the broader history of Africa's intellectual and cultural contributions to the world. Timbuktu's story is one of triumph and tragedy, of intellectual brilliance and political upheaval, of wealth and poverty, and of a city that rose to prominence and then fell into obscurity, yet never disappeared from the collective memory of Africa. Its tale serves as a reminder of the complexity of history, where the ebb and flow of power, culture, and knowledge create a rich tapestry that defies simple narratives. Timbuktu was never just a city of gold or knowledge. It was a symbol of Africa's capacity to create, to innovate, and to preserve its heritage in the face of adversity. Its rise and fall are not only a testament to the power of trade and intellect, but also to the resilience of a people determined to leave a mark on the world. As we begin to unravel the history of Timbuktu, we must understand it not as a static place frozen in time, but as a dynamic force that interacted with the world around it, shaping and being shaped by the currents of history. It was a city that symbolized the flourishing of African civilization, where the exchange of ideas, goods, and culture led to the creation of a unique intellectual and cultural tradition. In this sense, Timbuktu's story is one of interconnectedness, a story that speaks to the broader global history of exchange and intellectual growth that transcends borders and civilizations. The legend of Timbuktu, then, is not just a relic of the past, but a living, breathing part of Africa's story, a story that continues to resonate today. As we explore its past, we must remember that the city's legacy is not just one of ancient glory, but of enduring relevance, as it reminds us of the incredible intellectual and cultural wealth that existed long before colonialism and continues to shape Africa's future. Timbuktu's story is a vital chapter in the history of human civilization, one that deserves to be remembered, celebrated, and honored for the extraordinary legacy it represents. Timbuktu's significance was not built overnight. The city's emergence as a global hub of trade, culture, and knowledge was deeply tied to the complex political and economic forces of the medieval African world. In the centuries leading up to its golden age, the city was shaped by the rise of powerful empires and the intricate networks of trade that spanned the vast stretches of the Sahara Desert. Understanding this historical backdrop is essential to appreciating how Timbuktu became the revered city it was known to be, a city of intellect, of gold, and of divine influence. In the 9th and 10th centuries, long before Timbuktu's peak, the Sahelian region was already a place of significant activity. The vast expanse of the Sahara may have seemed like an inhospitable barrier, but it was also a bridge between the Mediterranean world to the north and the sub-Saharan kingdoms to the south. The caravans that crossed this desert were not only laden with goods like salt, gold, ivory, and slaves, but also carried with them ideas, cultures, and religions. This constant flow of goods and knowledge began to weave the early fabric of what would become the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, one of the most significant economic systems in medieval Africa. Timbuktu's rise to prominence, however, was inextricably linked to the rise of the Ghana Empire, which controlled vast parts of West Africa during the 9th and 10th centuries. Ghana's economy, based largely on gold and salt, laid the groundwork for a broader exchange that would soon include a host of other commodities, such as textiles, livestock, and even enslaved people. But it wasn't just the trade in material goods that transformed the region. The spread of Islam during this time also had a profound impact on the cultural and intellectual development of the Sahel, and Timbuktu was one of the first cities to absorb this influence in a meaningful way. As Islam spread southwards from North Africa, carried by traders and scholars, it found fertile ground in the Sahelian region. The religion's intellectual traditions, its emphasis on education, and its rich cultural heritage took root in places like Timbuktu, where scholars and merchants, many of whom were already versed in the Quran and Islamic sciences, began to establish centers of learning. Timbuktu's geographical location, positioned at the confluence of several trans-Saharan trade routes, made it the perfect place for such an intellectual transformation. It was here, along the banks of the Niger River, that the seeds of the city's future would be sown, even as the great empires of the region were emerging and evolving. By the 11th century, the Almoravid dynasty, based in what is now Morocco, was a dominant force in North Africa. Their expansion into the Western Sahel had a profound impact on the political landscape, and their influence on the spread of Islam was far-reaching. This period saw the establishment of Muslim rule over much of the region, with the cities of the Sahel, including Timbuktu, becoming increasingly connected to the wider Muslim world. Yet despite the growing religious unity, Timbuktu remained a city in transition. The Almoravids may have brought greater unity to the region, but their influence also stirred up tensions. The political dynamics in Timbuktu shifted as the city became embroiled in the broader conflict between competing empires for control of trade routes and resources. It was in the wake of the Almoravid expansion that the rise of the Mali Empire in the 13th century brought stability and prosperity to the region, laying the foundation for Timbuktu's golden age. Founded by Sundiata Keita in the early 1200s, the Mali Empire quickly became one of the largest and most powerful empires in West Africa. The Mali Empire's wealth was legendary, thanks in no small part to its control over the gold-producing regions in the south and its ability to control key trade routes through the Sahel. But it was the empire's embrace of Islam and its patronage of education and culture that would elevate cities like Timbuktu to unprecedented levels of influence. Under the rule of Mansa Musa, one of the most famous and wealthiest rulers in African history, Mali reached its zenith. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, accompanied by a caravan so vast it stunned the world, is one of the most iconic events in African history. His journey through the Sahara, laden with gold and accompanied by scholars, artisans, and diplomats, not only solidified his reputation as a powerful ruler, but also brought global attention to Mali and its cities, particularly Timbuktu. It was during this period of prosperity that Timbuktu became synonymous with wealth and learning. The city's role as a center of Islamic scholarship was nurtured. It began to attract scholars, theologians, and intellectuals from across the Islamic world. The Mali Empire's patronage of education and the arts led to the construction of monumental buildings, including mosques and madrasas, Islamic schools, that became centers of intellectual life in Timbuktu. The Sankore University, one of the most famous educational institutions in the Muslim world, was founded during this period, and it would go on to become a beacon of knowledge for centuries. The university attracted scholars from as far away as North Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe, and its curriculum covered a wide range of subjects, from theology and law to astronomy and mathematics. The intellectual atmosphere in Timbuktu during this time was one of extraordinary dynamism, where ideas were exchanged freely and where knowledge was passed down through the generations in meticulously preserved manuscripts. But the city's prosperity was not solely based on intellectual achievements. The wealth that flowed into Timbuktu through trade was immense. Timbuktu's position as a crossroads for goods coming from both the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa meant that the city became a commercial center of unparalleled importance. Merchants from across the Sahara, as well as from the coastlines of the Mediterranean, arrived in the city with goods to trade. Salt, a highly sought-after commodity in the desert regions, was exchanged for gold, ivory, and other luxury goods. Timbuktu's markets were vibrant and bustling, and the city became known for its opulence, attracting traders from distant lands. But alongside the wealth, Timbuktu's people also embraced a cultural and spiritual legacy, drawing on both the African traditions of the region and the Islamic heritage brought by traders and conquerors. This period in Timbuktu's history, between the 13th and 15th centuries, represents the peak of the city's influence. It was during these years that Timbuktu became the symbol of Africa's intellectual and cultural flowering. The city's libraries, which housed thousands of manuscripts, became repositories for a vast array of knowledge, encompassing everything from Islamic law and history to science and medicine. The manuscripts, many of them hand-copied and beautifully illuminated, were treasured by scholars and were seen as crucial to preserving knowledge for future generations. In fact, the intellectual legacy of Timbuktu was so significant that, in later years, historians would look to the city's libraries as a key source of African intellectual heritage. However, this golden age would not last forever. Even at the height of its influence, Timbuktu's prosperity was vulnerable to external forces, and the shifting tides of political and economic power would soon begin to chip away at the city's position. Yet, the intellectual and cultural impact of Timbuktu, forged in this period of immense wealth and learning, would continue to echo through history, influencing not only the West African region, but the wider Muslim world and beyond. By examining the rise of Timbuktu through the lens of political, economic, and intellectual transformations, we gain a deeper understanding of how this remarkable city became a beacon of knowledge in the heart of Africa. Its role in the trans-Saharan trade, its embrace of Islam, and its nurturing of intellectual growth were all key factors in shaping its identity as a center of learning, culture, and power. Timbuktu's story, built on these foundations, would become a testament to the enduring power of education, trade, and cultural exchange, forces that continue to shape the world today. The 15th and 16th centuries marked the height of Timbuktu's influence, but they were also the beginning of an inevitable decline that would reverberate through the region for centuries. The city, once a thriving epicenter of knowledge, wealth, and culture, now faced pressures from both within and outside its borders. This period is often remembered for the extraordinary wealth that flowed through its gates, the intellectual treasures it preserved, and the global reputation it garnered. Yet, beneath the veneer of prosperity, the forces of political instability, external invasions, and the shifting dynamics of trade were slowly reshaping the future of the city. By the 15th century, the Mali Empire, which had sustained Timbuktu's growth for over 2 centuries, was beginning to fragment. The empire had expanded to its greatest extent under the rule of Mansa Musa, who not only amassed immense wealth, but also invested heavily in the development of Timbuktu as a center of Islamic scholarship. However, after his reign, the empire faced internal divisions, weakening central authority and giving rise to smaller, competing states. The decline of Mali created a power vacuum in the region, leaving Timbuktu increasingly vulnerable to external threats. As the Mali Empire weakened, the Songhai Empire, which had long been a powerful rival to the Mali, began to rise in prominence. By the end of the 15th century, Songhai had eclipsed Mali as the dominant power in West Africa, and Timbuktu, which had once been part of the Mali Empire, became a contested prize in the power struggles of the region. Under the rule of Sunni Ali, the Songhai Empire expanded rapidly, conquering vast territories, including Timbuktu. The Songhai period marked a new chapter in the history of the city, one that was characterized by both stability and tension. The conquest of Timbuktu by Sunni Ali in 1468 brought the city under Songhai control, and the city's intellectual and cultural flourishing continued for a time under this new regime. However, the Songhai rulers, while powerful and wealthy, did not always prioritize the preservation of the intellectual and cultural legacy of Timbuktu in the same way that the Mali rulers had. Sunni Ali himself was known for his military prowess and his unrelenting conquests, rather than for his patronage of scholarship and education. His reign was marked by an emphasis on military expansion and the consolidation of power, which sometimes came at the expense of the intellectual and spiritual life of Timbuktu. Despite these tensions, the city's intellectual traditions remained strong. The 16th century, in particular, saw a continued flow of scholars, merchants, and travelers through Timbuktu, drawn by its reputation as a center of learning. The city's libraries, which housed tens of thousands of manuscripts, continued to be a source of pride for the people of Timbuktu. These manuscripts, carefully copied and preserved by generations of scribes, represented the intellectual heritage of the city and were considered invaluable treasures. The scholars who inhabited Timbuktu during this period continued to engage in debates on subjects ranging from theology and jurisprudence to astronomy and mathematics. One of the defining characteristics of this period in Timbuktu's history was the growing role of the city's religious institutions. While the city had long been a center of Islamic scholarship, the 16th century saw a deepening of the connection between religion and intellectual life. The city's great mosques and madrasas, particularly the Sankore Mosque, became increasingly important centers of religious learning. The scholars who worked in these institutions produced significant volumes of religious texts and commentaries, some of which would be studied for centuries to come. The Islamic influence in Timbuktu continued to be a unifying force, providing a foundation for intellectual engagement and cultural exchange. However, as the Songhai Empire expanded, it also encountered new challenges. The empire's vast territory, stretching from the Sahara in the north to the forests of the south, was difficult to govern. The size of the empire made communication and administration a complex task, and the empire's rulers had to contend with the threat of rebellion from regional leaders and internal dissension. The vast wealth that flowed into the Songhai Empire, particularly from the gold mines in the region, also made the empire a target for external invaders. In 1591, the Songhai Empire faced its most significant external threat, the invasion of the Moroccan forces under the leadership of Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur. The Moroccans, seeking to gain control over the lucrative gold trade that flowed through Timbuktu, launched a military campaign that would alter the course of the city's history. The Moroccan army, although smaller in number than the Songhai forces, was armed with gunpowder and cannons, which gave them a decisive advantage. The Songhai forces, though formidable in their own right, were no match for the Moroccan technology, and in 1591, the city of Timbuktu fell to the invaders. The Moroccan invasion marked the beginning of a long period of decline for Timbuktu. The once thriving city of knowledge, trade, and culture was left in ruins, its libraries looted, its scholars dispersed, and its political and economic systems upended. The loss of Timbuktu was a devastating blow to the intellectual and cultural heritage of West Africa, as the city's manuscripts and educational institutions were irreparably damaged. Many of the scholars who had made Timbuktu a center of learning were either killed, captured, or forced to flee, and the city's role as a beacon of intellectual life in Africa began to fade. Yet, even in the face of these calamities, Timbuktu's legacy was not entirely erased. The city's intellectual traditions endured in various forms, even as the political and economic systems of the region shifted. Some of the city's manuscripts were hidden or smuggled out of Timbuktu by scholars who sought to preserve the knowledge contained within them. These manuscripts, many of which are still being discovered and studied today, represent a vital link to the past and a testament to the intellectual resilience of Timbuktu. Despite the destruction wrought by the Moroccan invasion, the memory of Timbuktu as a center of learning, culture, and scholarship persisted. The centuries that followed the fall of Timbuktu saw the city gradually sink into obscurity. The political and economic importance of Timbuktu waned as new powers emerged in the region, and the city's influence in the wider world diminished. Yet, the legacy of Timbuktu would never be entirely forgotten. Over time, as scholars and historians rediscovered the manuscripts and stories of the city, the importance of Timbuktu as a center of African intellectual and cultural heritage began to be recognized once again. The city's manuscripts, though scattered and fragmented, were found to contain invaluable insights into African history, religion, science, and culture. Today, the city of Timbuktu stands as a symbol of the intellectual and cultural achievements of medieval Africa. While much of its physical and political grandeur has faded, the legacy of its intellectual heritage remains a powerful reminder of Africa's contribution to world civilization. The story of Timbuktu, from its rise as a center of trade and knowledge to its decline and rediscovery, is a testament to the enduring power of knowledge, the resilience of cultures in the face of adversity, and the importance of preserving and celebrating intellectual traditions. Timbuktu's journey, though marked by tragedy and loss, continues to inspire those who seek to understand the rich history of Africa and its profound influence on the world. In the wake of the fall of the Songhai Empire, and with the Moroccan invasion of 1591 marking the beginning of a protracted period of decline, the once vibrant city of Timbuktu faced a series of challenges that would forever alter its place in history. The cultural and intellectual traditions that had thrived for centuries seemed on the brink of extinction. Yet, as with so many great centers of civilization, the decline of Timbuktu was not a simple cessation of influence. Rather, it was a process shaped by both external and internal forces, some of which sought to erase its legacy, while others worked quietly to preserve it for future generations. After the Moroccan conquest, the city found itself caught in a political and military struggle that robbed it of much of its former glory. Under the rule of the Saadian dynasty in Morocco, the city's intellectual and cultural life began to wither. The invasion itself was devastating not only because of the loss of political control, but because it resulted in the looting and destruction of Timbuktu's priceless libraries. Thousands of manuscripts were taken, many of them lost forever, while others were smuggled away or hidden by local scholars, attempting to preserve the knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries. In the years that followed, the city's importance as a center of trade and scholarship diminished, overshadowed by other emerging powers in the region. Yet, while the intellectual and economic powerhouse that Timbuktu had once been seemed to be fading into the past, the city's cultural resonance was far from extinguished. Timbuktu's legacy, encapsulated in its manuscripts and the knowledge that they contained, lived on through the people who had called the city home. The intellectual traditions of Timbuktu were deeply embedded in the fabric of West African society. Scholars who had studied in the city and those who had left after its fall continued to carry with them the memory of its great libraries and its scholarly debates. Many of these scholars, though scattered by war and displacement, helped to transmit the knowledge of Timbuktu to other regions of Africa and beyond. One of the key elements of this intellectual continuity was the preservation of Timbuktu's unique manuscripts. The city had, over centuries, become a hub for the creation and distribution of written texts. Manuscripts in Arabic, and later in local languages, filled the shelves of the city's great libraries. These texts were not just books for study. They were vital tools of education, keeping alive the intellectual heritage of the Islamic world and beyond. These manuscripts, carefully copied by hand and sometimes illuminated with intricate designs, contain knowledge on a wide range of subjects: Islamic law, astronomy, medicine, history, and philosophy. While the external forces of conquest had temporarily disrupted the continuity of learning in Timbuktu, the legacy of these manuscripts endured. In the centuries that followed, Timbuktu was to experience periods of relative peace, interspersed with chaos. The city itself became an emblem of Africa's lost intellectual golden age, a place remembered for its role as a beacon of learning and culture. As African and European historians rediscovered the city's legacy in the 19th and 20th centuries, a renewed interest in Timbuktu began to take shape. Scholars, both from Africa and abroad, began to sift through the remaining manuscripts, many of which had been preserved in the hands of local families and distant communities. Some manuscripts were hidden in the remote desert regions. Others were passed from one generation to the next, kept safely within the walls of private collections. Over time, these manuscripts became an invaluable resource for historians and researchers who sought to unlock the mysteries of Timbuktu's intellectual history. While the intellectual legacy of Timbuktu was preserved in part through these manuscripts, the city's political and economic relevance continued to wane. The rise of colonial powers in the 19th century exacerbated the city's decline. The European scramble for Africa reached the Sahel, and new colonial borders and economic systems disrupted the region's traditional political structures. Timbuktu, once a thriving city in the heart of the West African trading world, became increasingly marginalized as European-controlled trade routes supplanted older patterns of exchange. The city, which had once been a key player in the trans-Saharan trade network, saw its role diminished as European colonial powers expanded their influence and control over the region. This period of colonization further fragmented Timbuktu's ties to its intellectual and cultural past. The French colonial empire, which had established control over much of West Africa by the late 19th century, viewed Africa through a Eurocentric lens, often undermining local traditions and knowledge systems. Timbuktu, as a symbol of African intellectualism, was neglected, its significance overlooked in the wider narrative of European colonial expansion. Many of the city's remaining treasures were either destroyed or locked away in colonial archives, where they remained inaccessible to the broader African population. Yet even as the political and economic decline of Timbuktu continued throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the city's intellectual legacy persisted. Local communities in the region, many of whom had deep ties to the city's past, continued to honor the memory of Timbuktu's golden age. The oral traditions that had long been a part of West African cultures kept the story of the city alive, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Elders passed down the tales of Timbuktu's glory days, recounting its role as a center of learning, its magnificent libraries, and its importance as a place where scholars, merchants, and artists from across the Islamic world converged. These stories, rich with pride and reverence for the past, serve as a living testament to the city's once great intellectual influence. As the 20th century progressed, Timbuktu found itself increasingly in the spotlight of global interest, especially as post-colonial African nations began to redefine their identities and reclaim their historical narratives. The city's role in the broader history of Africa was slowly being reinterpreted, and scholars and activists began to emphasize the importance of Timbuktu as a symbol of African heritage and intellectual achievement. In the 1960s and 1970s, the drive to protect and preserve African cultural heritage gained momentum, and Timbuktu, as one of the most important cultural landmarks in the continent, was included in these efforts. The creation of the Timbuktu Manuscripts Project in the 1990s was one of the most significant steps in ensuring that the intellectual treasures of the city would be preserved for future generations. This project aimed to catalog, preserve, and protect the thousands of manuscripts that remained scattered across the region. It was a daunting task, as many of the manuscripts were fragile and deteriorating, having been stored in less than ideal conditions. However, the project was a vital step in safeguarding the knowledge that had once flowed freely through Timbuktu's great libraries. The manuscripts, many of which had been hidden away in private collections or stored in local mosques, were meticulously cataloged, digitized, and studied by scholars from around the world. Despite these efforts, Timbuktu's history was still in danger of being lost. In 2012, the city's cultural heritage faced another devastating threat when Islamist militants seized control of the region and began to destroy cultural monuments, including many of the city's historic mosques and tombs. This was a painful reminder of how fragile the preservation of history can be. However, even in the face of this destruction, the resilience of the people of Timbuktu and the international community's efforts to protect the city's heritage once again underscore the importance of Timbuktu's legacy. Today, Timbuktu stands as a symbol not only of the resilience of African intellectual traditions, but also of the broader struggle to reclaim and preserve Africa's cultural heritage in the face of colonialism, war, and modern-day challenges. The city may no longer be the bustling center of trade and scholarship that it once was, but its intellectual legacy endures. The manuscripts that once filled its libraries are now scattered around the world, their words continuing to illuminate the rich history of West Africa and beyond. Timbuktu's place in history as a center of knowledge and culture is secure, not only because of the legacy of its past, but also because of the continued efforts to ensure that this legacy is never forgotten. The story of Timbuktu is one of cycles, of rise and fall, of prosperity and decline, but it is also a story of perseverance. The city's cultural and intellectual contributions to the world are vast, and its history, though interrupted by conflict and conquest, continues to resonate today. Timbuktu is more than just a city. It is a symbol of Africa's enduring intellectual spirit and its capacity to shape the world, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. Its journey is a reminder that knowledge, once created, never truly disappears. It is passed from one generation to the next, sustaining civilizations and enriching cultures for centuries to come. As the centuries unfolded and the political landscape of West Africa shifted, the legacy of Timbuktu continued to evolve. While its period as a dominant center of trade and intellectual enlightenment had passed, the city's historical significance remained undeniable. The cultural, spiritual, and intellectual contributions that Timbuktu had made to both African and global civilizations continued to echo long after the decline of its economic and political power. By the 17th century, the city was no longer a flourishing metropolis, yet it continued to attract attention due to its storied past, its mysterious allure, and the scholarly work that it had long inspired. In the wake of the Moroccan invasion and the fall of the Songhai Empire, the once thriving commercial routes that passed through Timbuktu began to shift. New powers in the region, such as the Fulani, the Bambara, and the Tuareg, emerged, altering the political and economic dynamics of the region. Timbuktu, with its strategic location on the banks of the Niger River, still held a certain degree of regional importance, but its status as a major hub for trans-Saharan trade had waned. As the caravans that once brought goods from North Africa to the south diverted their routes to new centers, Timbuktu's prominence as a trade city diminished, and it entered a period of relative stagnation. However, despite this decline in political and economic power, Timbuktu retained its spiritual and intellectual importance. Its libraries, though looted and threatened with destruction in the wake of invasions, were not entirely lost. Many of the manuscripts that once filled its great institutions have been carefully hidden away, preserved by those who understood their value, both for the city and for the future. The city's scholars, although fewer in number than before, continued to produce new works in the fields of Islamic scholarship, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Timbuktu's spiritual importance as a center of Islamic learning never fully waned. It remained a place of pilgrimage for those seeking deeper knowledge of the faith, and its mosques, though less visited by large numbers of scholars, continued to be revered as centers of learning. The 18th and early 19th centuries saw Timbuktu's importance begin to fade further, but its intellectual legacy remained influential. The city's reputation as the symbol of African scholarship persisted, especially as European explorers, missionaries, and colonial officials began to journey to the Sahel in search of knowledge about the mysterious city. For Europeans, Timbuktu had taken on an almost mythical quality, an exotic and distant place associated with riches and learning. This perception was partially fueled by the writings of early explorers and traders who painted a picture of a city buried in the desert, full of untold treasures, intellectual riches, and untapped mysteries. These explorers were drawn by the city's history and its legendary status. But when they finally arrived in the 19th century, they often found a city far less grand than the one described in popular tales. Nonetheless, the city's allure was undeniable, and the myth of Timbuktu as a haven of knowledge persisted well into the 19th and 20th centuries. European explorers, such as the Scottish missionary and explorer Mungo Park, who journeyed through West Africa in the late 18th century, and the French explorer René Cayley, who famously reached the city in 1828, became central to the Western narrative of Timbuktu's mystique. Cayley, in particular, became the first European to return from Timbuktu with an account of his journey, dispelling much of the myth while simultaneously fueling further interest in the city. His account provided the first concrete evidence that Timbuktu, while diminished in grandeur compared to its heyday, still existed and was still a place of immense historical and cultural significance. Although the city was no longer the seat of a vast empire or a global trade center, its historical reputation had endured. The manuscripts that had been hidden away in local homes, mosques, and private collections, many of them forgotten or disregarded by both local inhabitants and outsiders, began to be rediscovered. Researchers, both from Africa and Europe, began to recognize the immense value of these documents. They were more than mere relics of a bygone era. They were records of intellectual history, texts that spoke to Africa's significant contributions to the world's understanding of philosophy, science, theology, and law. These manuscripts, many of which had been meticulously copied by hand, represented centuries of knowledge and scholarship. However, as the colonial era spread across Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Timbuktu's role in the global intellectual sphere continued to diminish. European colonial powers redefined the region, reordering political boundaries and implementing new economic systems that further marginalized traditional centers of African scholarship. Under colonial rule, many African intellectual traditions were undervalued or ignored, including those of Timbuktu. The city, once a beacon of learning, became a symbol of Africa's perceived backwardness in the eyes of colonial officials. While the knowledge preserved in Timbuktu's manuscripts was slowly rediscovered by scholars, it was often framed within a European academic context, reinforcing the notion that African scholarship was a subjugated or secondary form of knowledge. The 20th century was a period of reevaluation for African history, especially as many African nations gained independence from colonial rule. Scholars began to recognize the importance of places like Timbuktu in reasserting the intellectual contributions of Africa to the broader world. Timbuktu's historical significance was increasingly acknowledged not as a passive recipient of external knowledge, but as an active center of intellectual production. It was a vital hub for Islamic learning, but it also contributed greatly to the development of African philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and law. By the middle of the 20th century, the city had become an important symbol in the broader movement to recover African history and knowledge. Scholars from Africa and beyond began to take a more nuanced view of Timbuktu, appreciating it as a product of both indigenous African intellectual traditions and Islamic scholarship. Despite these advancements in the recognition of Timbuktu's legacy, the city continued to face challenges. The 20th century was also a time of civil unrest, economic hardship, and political instability in Mali, where Timbuktu is located. The region underwent numerous upheavals as local governments struggled to maintain control in the face of larger political pressures. The city itself was sometimes overlooked by the central government, which focused on modernizing other parts of the country. Timbuktu, in many ways, remained a relic of the past, and its role as a center of intellectual achievement was not fully revived until the 21st century. The recognition of Timbuktu as a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 1988 was a significant step in the preservation and protection of the city's cultural and intellectual legacy. The designation highlighted the global importance of Timbuktu's manuscripts, mosques, and other historic structures. It also marked a turning point in how the world viewed the city's historical significance. However, the years that followed were not without their challenges. The early 21st century brought new threats to Timbuktu's cultural heritage, most notably the rise of militant groups in the region. In 2012, Timbuktu faced one of its greatest threats in modern history when Islamist militants took control of the city. During their occupation, they destroyed many of the city's historic buildings and manuscripts, further jeopardizing the preservation of its legacy. The militants, who opposed the city's rich Islamic intellectual traditions, sought to erase its cultural heritage by attacking some of its most important religious and academic sites. Despite these challenges, Timbuktu's intellectual and cultural legacy continues to inspire efforts to protect and preserve its history. Following the intervention of international forces and the eventual recapture of Timbuktu, many of the city's manuscripts were recovered, some of them hidden away by local families, while others were returned after being looted. The loss of so many of Timbuktu's historical treasures was a painful chapter, but the recovery of these manuscripts signaled a renewed commitment to preserving the city's role in the global narrative of intellectual achievement. Today, Timbuktu stands at the crossroads of history. While the city is no longer the thriving center of trade and knowledge it once was, its legacy as a place of intellectual cultural, and spiritual significance endures. The city's manuscripts continue to be studied and cataloged by scholars around the world, offering insights into the intellectual history of Africa and the wider Islamic world. Timbuktu is a symbol of Africa's rich intellectual heritage, a heritage that was almost lost to the ravages of time, war, and colonialism, but that is now being rediscovered and celebrated. In the end, Timbuktu's legacy is not just confined to its past glory as a center of gold and knowledge. It is also a living legacy, one that continues to inspire scholars, educators, and activists today. Timbuktu serves as a reminder that the preservation of knowledge and culture is a continual effort, one that requires vigilance and dedication. Its story is one of resilience, of a city that has withstood both internal and external pressures, but that continues to shine as a beacon of African intellectual heritage. Timbuktu's journey is a testament to the enduring power of knowledge and the importance of preserving the stories and histories that shape the world. Timbuktu, a city whose name resonates through history as a symbol of intellectual wealth, spiritual fervor, and cultural heritage, was not merely a product of its time. It was a focal point that influenced the evolution of ideas and practices across Africa and the wider world. Even as it began to lose its former political and economic dominance, its intellectual vibrancy continued to serve as an inspiration, an ideal, and a profound reminder of Africa's historical capacity for knowledge production. During the 17th and 18th centuries, as the trans-Saharan trade routes shifted and the city's role as a center of commerce waned, the intellectual traditions of Timbuktu still held the city in a place of high esteem. Timbuktu's academic heritage was more than a matter of historical curiosity. It became a symbol of the enduring strength of African intellectualism. Even though the city had been reduced in its political influence by the time the 17th century arrived, the legacy of the manuscripts and knowledge that it housed remained untarnished by time. The city's great libraries, though no longer bustling with the same intensity, continue to serve as places of learning and reflection. The scholars who had once flocked to Timbuktu still recognized its cultural and spiritual significance, even as their personal or professional circumstances changed. And while external political forces may have diminished its immediate influence, its reputation as a hub of knowledge and learning spread beyond the confines of the Sahel and attracted attention from travelers, explorers, and academics from across the world. During this period, Timbuktu became a focal point in the intellectual debates surrounding Africa's role in global history. The city stood as a symbol of the lost African Golden Age, often depicted in Western narratives as the last vestige of a once thriving intellectual civilization. However, there was a growing body of thought, both within and outside Africa, that began to counteract the narrative of Africa as a dark continent, void of intellectual and cultural sophistication before European intervention. Scholars began to assert that the intellectual vibrancy of cities like Timbuktu not only survived, but could serve as an antidote to the misrepresentations of African history. The city's reputation as a hub for Islamic scholarship, particularly after its conquest by the Songhai Empire, endured long after the empire itself had faded. Many of the city's greatest intellectuals were Muslim scholars who had dedicated themselves to the study and interpretation of the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence. These scholars wrote extensively on various subjects, including theology, law, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Timbuktu was regarded as a major center for the dissemination of Islamic knowledge in West Africa, and it attracted students and scholars from all parts of the Muslim world. Despite its decline as a commercial and political center, its intellectual traditions continued to serve as a powerful force in the region, guiding both religious practices and broader intellectual discourse. In this respect, Timbuktu's continued relevance throughout the 17th and 18th centuries was deeply intertwined with the larger political shifts in West Africa. The city's intellectual role was now largely supported by local rulers and religious institutions, but it had nevertheless been impacted by broader geopolitical events, such as the decline of the Mali and Songhai empires and the rise of new regional powers. The city's stability, at least in terms of its intellectual output, was secured through the commitment of its local scholars and religious leaders who worked to preserve Timbuktu's manuscripts. Many of these manuscripts, some of which were centuries old, were preserved in private collections and small libraries across the city. Some of these collections would later become the foundation for the work of scholars in later years, when international interest in Timbuktu reached a new peak. The 19th century, however, brought new challenges for Timbuktu. With the advent of European colonialism, the city became increasingly marginalized within the global order. As European powers began to carve up Africa and impose their own systems of governance, traditional centers of African knowledge, such as Timbuktu, were pushed to the periphery. European colonial administrators often dismissed the intellectual traditions of Africa, seeing them as inferior to the knowledge systems of Europe. In many ways, the narrative of African intellectual decline became tied to the colonial project, as colonizers worked to civilize Africa, often erasing or belittling local knowledge systems in the process. Timbuktu, once a beacon of knowledge, now found itself caught between the forces of colonial conquest and the growing need to assert African identity and intellectualism in the face of European dominance. In the early 20th century, however, a renewed interest in Timbuktu began to emerge, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a vital symbol of Africa's intellectual legacy. European explorers and researchers, seeking to understand the true history of the African continent, turned their attention to the city's manuscripts. Among them was the French explorer René Caillie, who famously traveled to Timbuktu in 1828 and returned to Europe with accounts of the city's intellectual and cultural history. His writings were instrumental in sparking a broader European interest in Timbuktu, which in turn would lead to further expeditions and research focused on its manuscripts. Scholars began to recognize the value of these documents, both for their historical insights and for their contribution to the study of Islamic and African thought. By the mid-20th century, as African nations gained independence from European colonial powers, the intellectual legacy of Timbuktu was increasingly seen as part of the larger struggle for African identity and self-determination. As part of the post-colonial movement, African scholars began to reclaim the intellectual heritage of the continent, highlighting the ways in which African civilizations, particularly those in West Africa, had made significant contributions to global knowledge. Timbuktu was at the heart of this intellectual revival. The city's legacy, along with the manuscripts it had produced, became a symbol of Africa's potential to contribute meaningfully to the global knowledge economy. These efforts were seen as not only a reclaiming of history, but also a necessary step in dismantling colonial narratives that had sought to erase or distort Africa's intellectual past. During the 1980s and 1990s, international efforts to preserve Timbuktu's intellectual heritage gained momentum. Recognizing the immense value of the manuscripts housed in the city, organizations such as UNESCO began to take action to protect and preserve Timbuktu's libraries. Timbuktu was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988, marking a significant step in recognizing the city's cultural and intellectual contributions. However, the physical preservation of the city's manuscripts and buildings proved to be an ongoing challenge. Many of the manuscripts, stored in the homes of local families, were vulnerable to environmental damage, and efforts to digitize and catalog them were hampered by a lack of resources. At the same time, political instability in Mali threatened the preservation efforts, as the city was periodically caught in the crossfire of regional conflicts. Despite these challenges, the commitment to preserving Timbuktu's intellectual legacy never faltered. In 2012, the world witnessed a devastating moment in the city's modern history. Islamist militants, seeking to impose their own interpretation of Islam, seized control of Timbuktu and began systematically destroying many of its cultural and religious monuments, including several historic mosques and tombs. These militants viewed the intellectual traditions of Timbuktu as a threat to their own beliefs and set about erasing the cultural identity of the city. The destruction of these irreplaceable buildings and manuscripts sent shockwaves around the world. Yet, the people of Timbuktu, in collaboration with international organizations and scholars, took extraordinary steps to protect what remained. Many of the manuscripts were smuggled out of the city and hidden in private collections, preventing further losses. When the militants were driven out in 2013, the world breathed a sigh of relief, but the scars of the destruction remained. In the aftermath of the crisis, the international community, along with local Malians, embarked on an ambitious effort to restore and protect the city's cultural heritage. The manuscripts that had been hidden away were gradually returned, and work on preserving Timbuktu's historic buildings and libraries resumed. The spirit of resilience that had defined Timbuktu throughout its history persisted, and the city's intellectual legacy began to be recognized on a global scale. Researchers from around the world, many of them scholars who had long been interested in the city's history, worked together to catalog, digitize, and restore the manuscripts that had survived the crisis. The manuscripts themselves continued to shed light on the history of West Africa, the Islamic world, and the broader global context of medieval scholarship. Today, Timbuktu's legacy stands as a testament to the resilience of intellectual traditions and the enduring power of knowledge. Though the city may no longer be the thriving center of trade and learning it once was, its influence continues to reverberate across Africa and beyond. Timbuktu's history, its manuscripts, and its intellectual contributions are part of the larger narrative of Africa's place in the world, a place not of backwardness or isolation, but of vibrant intellectual engagement and cultural achievement. In an age where knowledge is both a commodity and a tool for empowerment, Timbuktu's legacy reminds us that true knowledge transcends borders and that history's greatest treasures are often hidden in the most unexpected places. As the 19th century drew to a close and the world entered the modern age with rapid industrialization, technological advances, and the expansion of European colonial empires, Timbuktu found itself increasingly sidelined in the global narrative. Despite its glorious past as a hub for intellectual, spiritual, and commercial exchange, the city had long been caught in the shifting tides of history. After centuries of decline, foreign invasions, and the imposition of colonial borders, Timbuktu's importance as a major political and commercial center in West Africa had diminished. However, what was not immediately evident was that the city's cultural and intellectual legacy had not disappeared. Timbuktu had transformed, not into a forgotten relic, but into a symbol of African intellectual resilience, a quiet, enduring testament to Africa's historical contributions to the world's knowledge and culture. In the colonial period, European powers systematically restructured the African continent, creating artificial borders that disrupted traditional trading routes and political networks. The rise of European colonialism left Africa in the hands of foreign rulers, often with little regard for the cultural heritage of the peoples they governed. Timbuktu, situated in the remote desert region of Mali, was further marginalized. It had lost its former political significance in the wake of the collapse of the Songhai Empire, and its role in global trade had become secondary to coastal ports under European control. Yet, even as Timbuktu's economic and political power faded, the city's reputation as a place of deep intellectual tradition remained intact. Throughout the colonial period, Timbuktu stood as a beacon of African intellectual heritage, a place remembered for the manuscripts that had been painstakingly preserved over centuries, often hidden from the colonial gaze. The intellectual legacy of Timbuktu, particularly its manuscripts, became an object of fascination in the West. These ancient texts, many written in Arabic and some in local languages, contain knowledge on subjects ranging from Islamic law and theology to medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and history. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, Western explorers and scholars began to visit the region in search of what they perceived as Africa's intellectual past. These explorers, such as René Cayley, who famously became the first European to enter Timbuktu in 1828 and return safely to tell the tale, brought the city's legacy back to the attention of Europe and the wider world. In their accounts, Timbuktu was depicted as a mysterious, almost mythical place, a city of gold, knowledge, and hidden treasures. While many of these accounts exaggerated the wealth of the city, they also helped to cement Timbuktu's reputation as the Pearl of the Desert and a symbol of Africa's historical intellectual achievements. However, despite the curiosity and fascination that Timbuktu's story evoked in Europe, little was done to protect or preserve the city's heritage during the colonial period. The city itself remained a relatively isolated place. Its ancient libraries and the manuscripts they contained left largely undisturbed by the outside world. While the intellectual traditions of Timbuktu were respected by local scholars, they were often viewed with skepticism or indifference by colonial administrators who dismissed African intellectualism as inferior to European thought. Timbuktu's physical decline, coupled with the absence of significant economic investment or cultural promotion, meant that the city's historical and cultural treasures were vulnerable to neglect, exploitation, and destruction. It was not until the post-colonial era that the true value of Timbuktu's intellectual heritage began to be fully recognized. Following the independence of Mali in 1960, the new government sought to reclaim the country's cultural identity, and this effort included the rediscovery and preservation of Timbuktu's manuscripts. The newly independent Malian state understood the significance of the city's history, not just as a relic of the past, but as a living testament to Africa's intellectual history. This period marked the beginning of a concerted effort to safeguard the manuscripts and restore the cultural legacy of the city. However, the task was monumental. Many of the manuscripts have been scattered across private collections and small local libraries, hidden away for safekeeping. The manuscripts had survived centuries of tumult, but their preservation was threatened by the ravages of time, climate, and neglect. In the 1980s, the international community took notice of the plight of Timbuktu's intellectual treasures. Timbuktu's manuscripts, many of which were housed in families' private homes, began to attract the attention of scholars and historians. UNESCO, the United Nations educational, scientific, and cultural organization, played a pivotal role in drawing international attention to the importance of the manuscripts and the city's cultural heritage. In 1988, UNESCO designated Timbuktu as a World Heritage Site, recognizing its historical and cultural significance not only for Africa, but for the world. This designation served as a catalyst for global efforts to protect the city's heritage and ensure that its intellectual legacy would be preserved for future generations. Yet, despite the newfound global attention, Timbuktu's fragile state remained a significant challenge. In the following decades, efforts to protect Timbuktu's intellectual heritage were stepped up. Local organizations, in collaboration with international institutions, began to catalog and digitize the manuscripts, ensuring that their contents would be preserved for posterity. This effort required both technological innovation and a deep understanding of the delicate nature of these ancient texts. Timbuktu's manuscripts were often written on brittle materials such as parchment or paper and the dry desert climate. While helpful in preserving them, also posed a threat. Proper conservation methods, including digitization, were deemed crucial to preventing further degradation of the texts. Despite these efforts, the manuscripts and the city's cultural heritage were soon to face new, unexpected threats. In 2012, the city of Timbuktu fell into the hands of armed Islamist militants during a period of regional instability in Mali. The militants, part of a larger insurgency that sought to impose a strict interpretation of Islamic law, set about destroying many of Timbuktu's historical sites, including the famous Sufi shrines and the mosques that had long been at the center of the city's intellectual life. Perhaps most devastating of all was the threat to the manuscripts themselves. The militants targeted the city's libraries and homes, seeking to eradicate what they saw as un-Islamic knowledge. For a time, it seemed as though Timbuktu's intellectual heritage was on the brink of annihilation. However, in a remarkable act of resistance, the people of Timbuktu, aided by local scholars, took extraordinary measures to protect the manuscripts. In the face of the threat of destruction, Many of the city's manuscripts were secretly smuggled out of Timbuktu and hidden in private collections or in remote, inaccessible regions. When the militants were eventually driven out of the city, the manuscripts were recovered, many of them saved from destruction by the courageous efforts of local families and scholars. The resilience of the people of Timbuktu in the face of this threat further cemented the city's place as a symbol of intellectual resistance. The city, once again, became a focal point for scholars, historians, and activists working to preserve Africa's intellectual heritage. The international community rallied to support the restoration and protection of Timbuktu's cultural assets. Timbuktu's restoration efforts, both in terms of its manuscripts and its physical structures, became part of a broader movement to protect and celebrate Africa's cultural and intellectual heritage in the face of modern-day challenges. Today, the story of Timbuktu's intellectual legacy serves as both a reminder of the fragility of human knowledge and culture and a testament to the enduring power of knowledge itself. Timbuktu's manuscripts, carefully preserved and painstakingly cataloged, continue to provide invaluable insights into the history of the Sahel and West Africa, as well as the broader intellectual traditions of the Islamic world. While the city may no longer hold the political and economic power that once made it a hub for trade, its intellectual legacy endures. The efforts to protect and preserve Timbuktu's heritage are ongoing, and the city continues to attract scholars, historians, and tourists from around the world, drawn by its storied past and its ongoing contributions to global knowledge. Timbuktu's legacy is not just one of intellectual achievement, but also of resilience and hope. It reminds us that even in the face of adversity, knowledge, culture, and heritage endure, and that the preservation of this heritage is a vital part of shaping the future. While the city's glory days may be behind it, Timbuktu's place in the global narrative remains secure. Its manuscripts, its history, and its people continue to inspire those who seek to understand the rich tapestry of Africa's past and its lasting contributions to the world. Timbuktu, with its history of brilliance, resilience, and intellectual depth, continued to be a symbol of the complex relationship between Africa and the wider world, especially as the world entered the modern era. The city's story is not only one of intellectual and cultural contributions, but also of continuous reinvention and survival in the face of ever-evolving challenges. Although it lost much of its political and commercial prominence over the centuries, its place in the collective memory of Africa and beyond remained firm. The historical weight of its legacy persisted, constantly reminding the world of its once dominant role in shaping the intellectual landscape of Africa. The 19th and early 20th centuries brought both challenges and opportunities for Timbuktu. While the city's importance in the trans-Saharan trade had declined, its rich intellectual traditions continued to echo across the region. The demise of the great empires like Mali and Songhai led to a reconfiguration of political power in West Africa, and Timbuktu, although no longer at the center of this political framework, retained its cultural and spiritual significance. Throughout this time, the city became increasingly isolated from the changing dynamics of a larger African continent. Yet it was precisely in this isolation that Timbuktu's intellectual legacy was preserved. In the 19th century, Timbuktu's manuscripts, those fragile testaments to centuries of scholarship, remained one of the city's most important assets. Hidden away in private homes and family collections, these manuscripts represented a vast store of knowledge, covering everything from Islamic law and theology to astronomy, mathematics, history, and medicine. Even though the city itself had lost much of its former influence, these manuscripts continued to carry the flame of Timbuktu's intellectual heritage. They were guarded by families and local scholars, who viewed them not just as valuable historical documents, but as symbols of their cultural identity and intellectual pride. The city's manuscripts became a focal point for Western scholars and explorers in the 19th and early 20th centuries, sparking renewed interest in the once great city. The romanticized image of Timbuktu as an enigmatic city of wealth and learning continued to capture the imagination of outsiders, who were often more fascinated by the city's past glory than its contemporary reality. These explorers and scholars, most notably figures like René Caillie, who famously became the first European to return from a journey to Timbuktu, contributed significantly to the global recognition of the city's intellectual importance. However, this outside attention did not always lead to the preservation of Timbuktu's treasures, which remained largely untouched by external efforts to safeguard the city's cultural heritage. While some intellectuals began to acknowledge the significance of Timbuktu's manuscripts, the broader perception of African intellectualism during the colonial era remained dismissive. European colonial powers continued to perpetuate the notion that Africa had no meaningful history or culture other than that which had been shaped by European influence. The era of colonization marginalized Africa's intellectual contributions, with the imperial narrative of Africa as a dark continent, seeking civilization becoming dominant. In this context, Timbuktu was reduced to little more than a distant relic of Africa's distant past. The idea that the city had once been a thriving center of learning, philosophy, and science seemed too fantastical for many outside observers. As the 20th century unfolded, however, the narrative of African history began to shift. The rise of African nationalism and the movement toward decolonization brought a renewed interest in the cultural and intellectual history of the continent. African scholars, now freed from the shackles of colonial narratives, began to actively reclaim their historical identity. In this process, Timbuktu's manuscripts became a critical focal point, serving as a powerful symbol of Africa's rich intellectual legacy. These scholars sought to rewrite the historical narrative, positioning Timbuktu not as a faded memory of Africa's past, but as an enduring testament to the continent's intellectual achievements. In the post-colonial period, as African nations gained independence, the preservation of Timbuktu's intellectual heritage became an important priority. The newly formed governments in Mali, along with international organizations like UNESCO, recognized the significance of the city's manuscripts and sought to protect them. In 1988, Timbuktu was designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, an acknowledgement of the city's global importance and the need for its preservation. This international recognition helped to spur efforts to safeguard the manuscripts, many of which were still being kept in private homes. In collaboration with local authorities, scholars, and organizations, efforts were made to digitize and catalog the manuscripts, ensuring that their contents would be accessible to the world and protected from the ravages of time and climate. However, despite these preservation efforts, Timbuktu's manuscripts were not immune to the political and social upheavals that affected the region in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In 2012, the city found itself once again in the center of global attention, but this time it was for all the wrong reasons. A violent insurgency by Islamist militant groups, seeking to impose their radical interpretation of Islam, seized control of Timbuktu. Under their control, the city's cultural heritage became a target. The militants sought to destroy what they viewed as un-Islamic elements of the city's culture, and they made Timbuktu's historic mosques and the manuscripts themselves the focal points of their destruction.